Alright guys, Murph's here, and today we're going to talk about this. A Zev Technologies OZ-9 Compact Hypercomp chambered in 9mm. Now, in order to talk about this handgun, we are going to talk a little bit about background. Not necessarily history, because it's not a terribly historic firearm, but we are going to talk about the conditions that kind of brought this into existence to begin with. Now, in 1986, Glock hit the American shores and started getting picked up by law enforcement agencies, tactical teams, all those types of things. And because of that, it started having an ever-expanding aftermarket support infrastructure that really started to spur its popularity amongst the civilian populace. Now, with that would eventually become modifications, innovations, all those types of things, because we as American shooters really like to take a platform and change it up to our own desires, be it either just bring our own individual twist to the firearm or actual performance enhancing capabilities brought to the gun. Now, several things about the Glock design readily accommodated this type of innovation. First off, the plastic frame made it very easy to be able to modify for grips and all that kind of stuff. And then also the interchangeability of the parts, not necessarily being super tightly machined, allowed for a lot of drop-in parts from different manufacturers to be able to become available to tailor it to your tastes. Now, this kind of gets into a whole discussion between the build versus buy groups. Now, kind of my own opinions up front on this. There are a lot of people who buy a Glock and immediately start changing parts out on it before they've even shot it. And that's not to say that they already know what it is that they want as much as they know what they think they need. And a lot of it really comes down to individualizing the gun. And there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with making something your own. However, when you start to tell me that prior to putting any rounds down range, you've made performance enhancing upgrades to the gun, I am a little dubious as to how much you're actually increasing your own performance and how much you're actually putting a band-aid on bad performance. Now, keep in mind, guys, I shoot more than many. I'm not going to say I'm some insane trainer or anything along those lines, but I spend a lot of time out on the range. And I spend a lot of my time appraising changes before I go and make them to make sure that I'm actually going to get the most out of the transition, whatever change it is that I make, that I can. And make sure that I'm doing my part before I go and change something about the platform. There's an awful lot of people who assume that you can just buy performance. That's not necessarily the case. You still have to bring something at the end of the day. Now, we'll get more into the build versus buy discussion here by the end of this, but we do need to go ahead and start introducing the buy crowd, which is where the Zev Technologies pistol comes in at. Now, Zev Technologies originally made their business around selling Glock drop-in parts. And eventually they decided that they would go ahead and take a lot of their aftermarket improvements that they designed for the Glock and just drop it into their own pistol. And they're not the only manufacturer to have done this. You also have Shadow Systems and Polymer 80 and probably a couple other manufacturers that I can't think of right now who've done the same kind of thing. They've taken their design innovations and coalesced it into a singular pistol or line of pistols. Now, there's a couple things that go along with this. First off, someone would call this a Glock, and they wouldn't necessarily be wrong, but they wouldn't be right either. Somebody could call this a Glock clone, which would be more right. I refer to this and others like it as a Glock variant, kind of like how a Galil Ace is an AK variant. So the base product is present. There's the bones of whatever, base model it is that we're talking about, and then there's a whole bunch of additional features or aspects that are hung off this gun that make it very individual. So I prefer to refer to these as Glock variants. And we'll kind of discuss how this differs from a Glock as we go throughout it, and also how it's very similar as well. Alright guys, I think that pretty much covers the kind of background aspect of this. What we're dealing with here is a Gucci Glock, is somebody taking their aftermarket parts, putting it all onto one gun and selling it to the end user instead of the end user cobbling those parts together over time. So with that, why don't we go ahead and start talking about this particular pistol. Now, this is analogous to a Glock 19 handgun. here. So this is the compact version with the 4-inch barrel. And this barrel is actually where we got to start a lot of the current conversations. We can see this bronze color is actually a Zev standard. This is very much so on trend for their brand. Now, this is a match grade barrel. It has been crowned for accuracy, and it does contain traditional lands and grooves rifling as opposed to the polyagonal rifling of the Glock system, which means that you can shoot cast reloads through this if you're that kind of person who casts their own reloads. This is actually an excellent barrel. I don't necessarily attribute a lot of handgun accuracy to features and all that kind of stuff, as much as I put a greater onus on the person shooting the handgun to bring the accuracy, but this barrel's pretty nice. Now, this barrel has a lot more features than just the crowning. We also will note that this is where we get the Hypercomp part of the designation. Now, first off, right in front of these ports, which we'll talk about here in a moment, we have a front sight that is actually pinned to the barrel, and that is because our slide has been cut away. Now, you might say that this is kind of an odd choice, and I don't disagree with you. You could have kept the slide in place and actually just cut slots across the top of it in order to allow the gases to vent through the slide from the porting. However, this is an interesting opportunity to take a look at a different aspect of shooting dynamics whenever it is that we're talking about shooting handguns. By affixing the front sight to the barrel itself, the front sight moves less during pistol cycling. Now, one of the things that is kind of a check on your recoil management is if during slide cycling you don't lose track of your front sight. And that's actually a key aspect of being able to have rapid follow-up shots, is being able to track your front sight all throughout the cycling process. When it's attached to the slide, there's more movement that's involved in it, as opposed to when it's attached to the barrel. Now, as you can see here, we still have a modified Browning tilting cam system. So our barrel does move up as the slide moves back. However, that's just moving up and down instead of up and down and back and forth. So we're isolating a little bit of the motion at that point. Now, theoretically, this should make it easier to be able to track that front sight through or close to your rear sight and be able to get those faster follow-up shots. However, I've not been able to effectively evaluate this on this pistol. And that is because this gun has an optic equipped with it. And I am evaluating this gun how it is that it was brought to me. This is actually a friend's gun. And with that, though I can still pick up my iron sights through the optic window, they are still partially obscured. It's not the best way to test whether or not it is easy to consistently catch this front sight. And the one last little caveat I would throw along with this particular feature is that if you're the type of shooter who is not already effectively tracking your front sight during slide cycling, or not even trying to do that to begin with, this feature is going to be lost on you. Now, if you are somebody who's pursuing that in your own personal training, this would actually be a lot of help. Even though I haven't had a lot of opportunity to be able to appraise that, the actual aiming reference that I'm using is still affixed to the slide and is traveling back and forth. I do think this is a really good feature and would love to take the opportunity to be able to evaluate this at a different time. Now, keep in mind, this barrel, that Zev sells barrels, however, they don't really seem to sell the Hypercomp barrel all by itself. So that's kind of a bummer, because I think this is a pretty neat feature overall. Now, porting. When it comes to trying to get a pistol to recoil in a more linear manner with less muzzle rise and all that kind of stuff, you got a couple of different options. You have compensating and you have porting. Now, the issue with compensators is that they get added to the end of the slide and they lengthen your overall length, which means that you will run into some issues with holsters. You need either an open front holster or you need a little bit bigger holster, something to be able to accommodate that compensator. That is potentially detrimental to you, the end user. Now, with porting, you don't necessarily run into that problem. And an issue that is frequently pointed out with porting, or at least is expected to be a part of porting, is that you might have a diminishing return in your velocity, and then it also might be a negative impact on your night vision. Let's take a look at velocity first. Porting has a negligible impact on your velocity, so much so that it is not going to be the defining point between whether or not your handgun cartridge is effective, because ultimately, an opinion frequently expressed on this channel, handgun cartridges are ineffective at stopping fights. They're just convenient. So the small amount of velocity that we're losing from porting is not going to change that. So that's not a big deal. Now, the night vision aspect of this. I have not shot this in any significant low light conditions to be able to evaluate this. However, I have been looking into porting on handguns for quite some time, and I've watched quite a few videos and read quite a few articles on it. Aaron Cowan of Sage Dynamics actually did a very deep dive on the impact of compensators, porting, and bare muzzle handguns on night vision, and pretty much found there to be no real difference. So he's a pretty smart guy. I'll go ahead and take his word for it on that matter. Now, our slide has quite a few different cuts that have been made to it. We have front cocking serrations here, which front cocking serrations are kind of a hot button topic right now, it seems. A lot of people feel that they are an unnecessary addition and cost for no real performance increase. I understand that. I don't necessarily agree with it, but I don't necessarily disagree with it either. One thing that I would observe is that even if you have front cocking serrations, nothing says you have to use them. Now, I do prefer to run press checks utilizing front cocking serrations when I have them, but I can also utilize rear cocking serrations just as easily. I guess I'm ambidextrous that way. So just something to kind of take into account. Now, we will talk about press checks more here in just a little bit. However, before we get into that, I do want to go ahead and cover this railed dust cover that we have on this pistol. Now, this is actual M1913 Picatinny rail. This is not some sort of proprietary setup like you might run into with older Glocks or with HKs. So you can mount whatever lights or lasers you want to this handgun. The owner of this handgun has elected to not do so. And we're going to talk more about this in conjunction with another feature of the handgun here in just a little bit. Now, we do have a squared off trigger guard, so if you want to grip that, which some people still do, you know, to each their own, you can do so. It is not textured, however, so just keep that in mind. Though a little bit of skateboard tape right there would change that. Now, coming back to our kind of chamber area here. So once again, we have some fairly tasteful and very Zev style of cuts and all that kind of stuff. Now, you'll note here, way at the back of the chamber, we have a loaded chamber window so that we can be able to visually confirm whether or not there's a round in the chamber. And then also you will note that on the extractor, we have a Glock style tactile loaded chamber indicator, which is just a protrusion coming off of the extractor. Now, why are loaded chamber indicators important? Well, it's so that we can tell whether or not the firearm is loaded without having to conduct a press check. Now, in general, I still conduct press checks as a default setting for me, and a lot of that has to do with, first off, this window is not tactile, so in low light conditions you cannot tell whether or not there's a round in the chamber just by looking into that, unless you use a flashlight. And then with this protrusion on the extractor, this has actually been a huge issue for me with Glocks. I do not consider this to be tactile, because when you do actually have a round in there, it doesn't stand out as much as you might think, especially with a lot of the other cuts that are already along this slide. If you run your finger down this, you'll probably wind up wanting to do a press check anyway, because there's a lot of different textures along here to begin with, and it's very easy to lose track of whether or not that loaded chamber indicator was up, because right now I can feel it. My fingers are pressing against that ledge. Now, it's not necessarily protruding, but when it is protruding, it's not that much. So I don't consider these to be a good example of a loaded chamber indicator, of a tactile loaded chamber indicator. Something like the Sig M17 has an excellent loaded chamber indicator. So just kind of, you know, show the differences there. So I still conduct press checks. I still like to be able to make sure there's a round in the chamber. It's important to make sure there's a round in the chamber, because there's nothing more embarrassing than coming up from a ready position at a course or on a competition or something like that and having your gun go click and not boom when you fully intended for there to be a boom. And if it's embarrassing on the firing line, then it is absolutely terrifying in an actual real life situation where you might have to use your handgun. So press checks are important. Being able to verify your chamber is loaded is important, or at least the condition of your chamber is important. Regardless of how it is you achieve it, just make sure you're doing it. All right, so coming back to our optic, this is actually a Trichicon RMR Type 1 that the owner managed to get a smoking hot deal on. Now, of course, it's more common now to see the Type 2s, which have adjustment buttons and all that kind of stuff on the side. This is constant on, auto adjusting, all that kind of stuff. There were a lot of early complaints with the Type 1 that it didn't necessarily have the durability that was required. However, this optic has seen some love for sure over the years and is still working just fine. We're not entirely sure, but this looks to me to be about a 4 MOA dot and is very fast and easy to pick up. Actually, pistol optics are something I've been evaluating for some time. They are definitely, it's, in my opinion, no longer a discussion. These are the future. Every handgun is going to have a pistol optic before this is all said and done. Manufacturers every year are presenting more and more firearms options with optics capability. Some manufacturers have products in their line that don't have a non-optics ready capability model available. And that's awesome because you don't have to put an optic on it if you don't want to. But if you do want to have an optic on it, it's pretty nice to have the opportunity. Now we can see here, this footprint is very low because I would not necessarily call these iron sight suppressor heights, yet I have no problem being able to pick them up through the optic window. And that's kind of one of the advantages you get over something that's built for a specific type of optic. So this is a Trichicon RMR footprint that this was actually cut around so that this optic is able to direct mount without any type of like adapter plates or anything along those lines like you might see in the Glock MOS series or any of those other types of handguns that do the same type of thing. So this is supposed to be a more secure mounting system, though it is a very specialized mounting system. One of the great things about going with a Trichicon floor plan, I guess you could say, for your slide is that you've got a lot of options because quite a few others utilize that same pattern. All right, now one of the other things that that I really like about this optic is actually this dished cut here in the top, which is fantastic because if you were to drop this weapon and it were to land on the optic, those corners there would wind up taking the brunt of the impact, which puts it at a point that's not going to put too much pressure on the window and keep it from breaking. This is actually copyrighted by Trichicon, which is why you don't see anybody else doing it. These are really durable and well done optics, and I've had no trouble in being able to pick this up. This window is spacious, and I've not really had to change my presentation in order to be able to grab that dot, which I appreciate greatly. Which kind of gets into different aspects of shooting optics on pistols, but we can discuss that at a different time. All right, guys, now, of course, we have rear cocking serrations. That's a requirement. And our sights are blacked out, and the rear sight actually has some serrations cut into it in order to reduce glare, which I guess could be an issue. I've never had glare be an issue on pistol sights, but I guess it could be. All right, well, why don't we go ahead and get into some of the internal differences that you might find between this and some other Glocks out on the market. So for comparison's sake, I have a Glock 19 Gen 5 right here. All right, so if we look at the slides, we see that the overall layout is pretty similar. This slide from the Zev seems to be a little bit wider, just a bit. You see that we have space for some weight-saving cuts right here in the back of the slide where we really don't on this Gen 5. Now, the drop-safe plunger is different between these two, which this was actually a change made on the Gen 5. So with that, why don't we go ahead and take a look at this Glock 23 Gen 4 chambered in 40. And we can see here that those plungers are the same pretty much. Now, of course, there's still a slight slide dimensional difference, and of course the springs on both of these are different. This seems to run more like a Gen 3 spring in it, whereas the Gen 4 started the dual captive spring for the Glocks. So as we can tell, the internal aspects of the slides are pretty similar, but why don't we go ahead and take a look at the frames themselves. Now, here is where we actually see some pretty substantial differences. The Zev has this large metal piece that goes from dust cover all the way back almost to the end of this beaver tail right here. This is all steel, which we do not have on the Glock. We have steel inserts into a Glock, or excuse me, steel inserts into a plastic frame. This is very interesting. So the slide rails, the locking block, all that kind of stuff is set into plastic, whereas on this is a monolithic piece, kind of like a chassis system. which gives this gun greater rigidity. There's going to be more flex in the Glock 19 than there's going to be in this OZ-9 Compact, and that's very interesting to me. Now, what's even more interesting is if you just drive out this pin located right here in the front of the trigger guard, you can actually remove this lower and then be able to pop onto the grip frame that you want while also installing whatever slide it is that you want to have on top. So that's an interesting little bit of utility right there. It's very individual to the Zev Technologies OZ-9. I found that very interesting. Now, in addition to that, you'll note that our cruciform and all that kind of stuff are pretty much the same. The internal portions back here are almost exactly the same. They're just one set into a steel frame and the other's not. Now, question becomes, will these slides interchange? So let's go ahead and pop this OZ-9 slide on this Gen 5 lower, and trigger pulled, striker fell. So that seems to work just fine on this Gen 5. Let's go ahead and check it on the Gen 4 real quick. Yep, striker dropped. All right, interesting. So this will actually work on both of these guns. All right, guys, let me clean up my workspace here real quick since I've now got pieces lying everywhere. All right, so that is a look at the internals. Sorry about that. That's a look at the internals of our OZ-9. Now, coming down to the frame itself, we have a single side slide release. Now, a lot of people like to get broken up on this slide release, slide catch, blah, 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 blah. I don't really care. I kind of look at like a glass half empty versus half full. Am I drinking the glass or am I filling the glass? In this case, this slide release or catch works effectively as either. Very spacious, it's very easy to hit, it's not too stiff or anything along those lines. This is a really well done slide release. Now, in general, guys, I overhand rack pretty much everything because it works with pretty much everything, and I train on a lot of different platforms and all that kind of stuff. However, if I were to pick a handgun to run a slide release on, this handgun would most definitely be in the running. So there's something to kind of take with you on that one. Now, we do have some textured portions out here for kind of being able to have a memory point for your thumb whenever it is that you are presenting the pistol. Coming to our grip. Now, this is something that I found really interesting with this particular handgun. The grip does not look like it would be ergonomic. In fact, it looks almost the complete opposite of ergonomic. Even comparing this to a Gen 5, like, yeah, we don't have the Glock hump that so many people like to complain about on the Glock. However, this looks more like a 2x4 than this does, and this is what everyone calls a 2x4. But in gripping the handgun, I don't really have any complaints. Now, we do have a nice high cut underneath the trigger guard here in order to be able to grip the handgun higher. I do appreciate that. We have generous texturing going up the frame, much higher than you will find on a lot of other handguns. I appreciate that as well, since I have a tendency to use a little bit lighter grip with my lower fingers, which means that I need more surface area or more texture to be able to grip higher up on the gun. This does go ahead and take care of that. Now, I do find it odd that we kind of had these indentations running through here, which kind of swells out the back of the pistol just a little bit, which when I look at it, doesn't look like it would be comfortable. However, I have no issue in being able to effectively grip this handgun, so I guess it works. It's kind of one of those things where, like, I look at this and I go, that doesn't look that great, but it works just fine. So there's really nothing to complain about here, just some observations overall. Now, we do kind of have a finger groove type thing going on here, but it's not nearly as significant as the Glock Generation 4 finger grooves, which some people like to get really broken up about. I've never been too worried about them personally because they do kind of match my fingers, but if I'm not bothered by their presence, I'm most definitely not bothered by their absence either. So there's that. All right, so our trigger, this is actually Zev's Pro trigger, which is their flat face version, which has the little red safety dingus there, which I'm not too big a fan of this color, as I preferred it just been black, but you know, doesn't really take away from anything either. This is an incredibly light trigger. nice, easy, clean break, and a very short reset. Incredibly short reset. This trigger is an absolute joy. I'm not necessarily a trigger snob, but I gotta say this is a pretty good one. Now you'll also note that we have a fairly spacious Glock Gen 4 style magazine release located right here. It is very easy to hit. I've had no issues in being able to activate this magazine release. Now you'll also see that we have a flared mag well. This is actually something I consider to be a pretty good improvement on a Glock handgun, because I have a tendency to have a little bit of an issue with hitting Glock mag wells. Now, I don't notice it as much on this Gen 5, but on the Gen 4, of course, there we go. On the Gen 4, it can be a little difficult to hit the mag well perfectly every time. I've had no real struggles with hitting this mag well, this nice flared mag well on this Zev handgun. Now, as we can see here, at some point I switched from the provided Magpul magazine over to a Glock Generation 5 magazine, which we see it fits perfectly. And let's test this Gen 4 real quick. Yep, goes in no problem. The handgun did ship with 2 Magpul 15-round magazines, and it will fit any Glock compatible 9mm magazine as well. All right, guys, that pretty much covers features. How does it shoot? All right, on my first range trip with this handgun, I was initially blown away by accuracy. I had absolutely no problem with chewing out 2-inch circles at 7 yards with relative ease in 5-round shot groups. This handgun, it was dead on. The Optic is easy to catch. I have no real problem with being able to present and come up on that dot. And the trigger, absolute joy, reset, all that type of stuff. The gun does track very flat. The porting does a great job of keeping you on target and all that kind of stuff. No real complaints up until I did have 3 malfunctions with this handgun on the first range trip I took it out on. I had 1 failure to feed and 2 failures to eject. It almost looked like the extractor was underpowered and was having some trouble getting the spent casing out of the way before trying to load the next round. That's what it kind of struck me as, and I was very surprised by this because this is a premium handgun. This is a near $1,800 handgun. We shouldn't be having issues like that. I spoke to the owner on this particular subject, and he indicated to me that he had been told that this had a roughly 250 round break-in period, and he had not yet achieved that, which was a bit of a surprise to me. He's owned this for quite a few years, but, you know, not everyone gets out to the range as often as others. So, with that being the case, I did shoot this some more. I ran another box through it just this morning, and I've had 0 malfunctions, and that was actually with Blazer aluminum case 9mm. So that's pretty fantastic. When it came to transitioning to targets and all that kind of stuff, I was still able to pretty much keep my dot in the optics window, and the handgun just drives tacks. It's an absolute tack driver. So I have absolutely no complaints from shooting this handgun, that's for sure. All right, so with that, what are my recommendations for this handgun? This kind of gets into the build versus buy discussion here. When it comes to build versus buy, I think there's a very interesting utility in growing with the handgun and buying something that is good, a Glock, an MMP, a CZP-10, whatever it is, and then taking that to the range, and as you learn how to shoot, as you progress as a shooter, making different changes to the gun that you realize that you're putting in your effort, but you're not your ability has exceeded the capabilities of the firearm. So be that extended magazine releases or better grip texturing or more prominent sights, whatever it is that may be, you make those adjustments as you grow with the gun, and the gun morphs into this better overall tool for your purposes. Now, the problem with that is that can wind up getting really expensive really fast, especially if you go down some dead ends for things that don't necessarily work out for you. The other option is to train with that first handgun, make some adjustments and all that kind of stuff, identify things that you think are actually working out better for you, and then eventually selling it in order to be able to generate the capital to be able to buy a handgun like this that has all of those features right out the gate. That has its own utility with it. I don't know if it's necessarily the plan for everybody, and I most definitely understand the group of people who are probably in the comments section right now hoping for a more buy once, cry once type application. However, when we're talking $1,800 MSRP, that's a lot of cash. And if you're not necessarily in a position to be able to get $1,800 worth of performance out of this handgun, I don't necessarily think I would call that money well spent. Some things do still have to be earned. You can't necessarily buy performance. So I would keep that in mind whenever it is that you're making this decision. Now, does that mean that you can't grow into this handgun? No, I'm not saying that at all. What I'm saying is to kind of keep, your finances are your finances. You choose however it is that you want to spend them. However, something to keep in mind is that the vast majority of cheaper options out of the market probably outshoot the vast majority of shooters out in the world. So you don't have to spend this much in order to still get outshot by it. Now, what are my uses for this handgun? Well, currently, my uses for this handgun are just to bring it to you guys for the purpose of review and entertainment. However, this is kind of a part of evaluating Gucci-style handguns and seeing what it is that this gun exceeded me for and what it was that I was actually getting the most out of this handgun. That was an interesting thing to be able to evaluate for me throughout this preparing for the review process. And it's actually going to feed into a project that I have coming up that I'm just going to kind of dangle in front of you guys as a little bit of a teaser for the future. All right, guys. I think that pretty much covers my thoughts on this particular subject. I hope you guys found this interesting, and that's pretty much what I got. Have a good day.